We've talked about major terrestrial ecosystems, so of course our next step is to talk about major aquatic ones, right? Well, in freshwater ecosystems, we mostly tend to talk about lakes, unless you really want to study freshwater ecology, in which case rivers also matter. Rivers and lakes. Oh, and of course, swamps. Actually, there are several different types of swamp. For example, a bog, a fen, a meadow. Well, there are lots of types, but they don't really matter for us in grade 9. The main points that we need to know about freshwater ecosystems are that there are oligotrophic ones, where they are poor in nutrients, and eutrophic ones, which are rich in nutrients. Troph essentially means eat or eating in the language originally hailed from, which I can't remember if it was Greek or Latin, but it doesn't matter. Eu is true, just like eukaryote, true core. Well, so it's true food and poor food. So, if it's poor in food, it's not many nutrients, right? And they tend to be clear and look deeper, for the simple reason that you sometimes cannot tell whether or not these eutrophic lakes are in fact deep enough for, say, boating or diving. Why? Because eutrophic lakes tend to be awfully turbid. Turbid. This means that their visibility is fairly low. You cannot see very deep into them. In addition, eutrophic lakes tend to be shallower. And oligotrophic lakes tend to be deeper. Think about the amount of pollution you need to put into a eutrophic lake for the concentration of the nutrient to reach a sufficient level to cause one of these algal blooms that you're seeing here. Less than for the oligotrophic one, right? Well, the shallow lake has less tolerance for pollution than the deep lake, which means that eutrophic lakes tend to be shallow, for the simple reason that shallow lakes become polluted faster. Oh, also, a lot of the productivity in eutrophic lakes comes from plants growing up from the bottom, because sunlight can reach to the bottom. Whereas in oligotrophic lakes, often sunlight does not in fact reach the bottom, and there is a thermocline. So there are only plants growing off the side. Whereas in eutrophic lakes, you can have plants growing right off the bottom. So benthic photosynthesis is very valuable. It happens to be the case that in most rivers, plankton are basically not applicable as far as the production is concerned. Why? Think about how fast most rivers flow. Can plankton swim against a current that fast? No. No. Hence, it's usually bottom-dwelling plants, as long as the river is clear enough for light to reach the bottom. A watershed is the land area drained by a particular river. It is also called a drainage basin. So you trace a watershed by tracing a continuous line of high points along the surrounding terrain. So all the surface water that falls within the watershed drains to the same river. Please note that because rivers have branches, we call these tributaries. So suppose this river flows that way. This can have a smaller watershed, and the whole river might have a bigger watershed. Although if these two lines here don't match up, what that says is basically that there's another river that leads like this or something. Because at least on the outer bounds, they tend to match up. However, if we say have a tributary that's like, say, here, then clearly this tributary's drainage basin is not going to match up to to the boundary of the entire drainage basin, right? All right. River and lake ecosystems, that's about it for what we cover in grade 9. We cover more in higher biology classes. Marine ecosystems. Well, when you think of the ocean, what's the first thing you think of? If you thought water, yes, correct. Okay, sure, water. But if you thought a lot of water, like open water, yes, that is most of the oceans. And, wait a second. If we're going to grow photosynthesizers, don't we need nutrients and minerals? Where are the nutrients and minerals? Very low. So, in the open ocean, there is low productivity. Now, why is the open ocean important for life on Earth? Well, other than the fact that life on Earth is water-based and that's the biggest reservoir of water, there is also the fact that the open ocean is just so big. I mean, you might be thinking, yes, this sounds almost as obvious as you saying that there is life on Earth. But the point is, the open ocean is so big that even though it has low productivity per area, it still contains a significant portion of Earth's total production. The deep ocean, on the other hand, since there's no light, photosynthesis is impossible. They essentially rely on the detritus snow from above. Well, technically there's also chemosynthesis going on near black smokers, or undersea vents, as some people call them. As they're technically called. But most people tend to like black smokers better for some reason. Probably because it sounds a little cooler, maybe? I don't know. Anyway, so in the deep ocean, productivity is minimal and concentrated around thermal vents, hydrothermal vents. Now, continental shelf. Well, we are next to a continent. We have nutrients. Okay, so we even have sediment that's filled with nutrients and minerals pouring out onto the continental shelf. All right. Do we have light? Yes. Continental shelf is typically around 200 meters depth. Well then, that means there's photosynthesis. And so the continental shelves are the most productive parts of the ocean. Mangroves. Mangroves typically are near tidal pools and estuaries. So they are typically adapted for brackish water. If you treat them with full oceanic salt water, they will still die. But brackish water, which is a mixture of fresh and salt water, they can tolerate, unlike other trees. Which means that they have their own niche tolerating this water, and their roots, which are like tented, something like this, their roots provide lots of shelter for various organisms, especially, say, young fish. So mangrove forests are very important for fisheries. Well, some fisheries. They also protect the coastline from eroding too quickly. Now, let's think about other creatures that might live a little bit closer to salt water. So, if we don't have a tidal pool, and we don't have an estuary, and the ocean is just directly going up against the land, we know that there's tide, right? Well, okay, this happens even in estuaries, but it's most obvious in the open coast. So what happens? Each day the tide comes up. Oh, that's not as flat as I would like, but okay. And then it goes down, and then comes up again and goes down again. So twice a day. Now the tide is mostly due to the moon's gravity, but also partly to the sun, due to the sun's, which is why there is a matter of spring tide and neap tide. All right. So what happens to organisms that are living here? if they live here, they must go from dry to salt water twice a day. Whoa, these must be some tough creatures, and indeed they are. They must be adapted to extreme temperature changes as well, because think about what happens when on a cold day, when there's wind, the water goes away. Well, they're wet, and there's wind, so it's wind chill. They must be able to tolerate the wind chill, which can be quite cold, as in actually freezing temperatures, as described here. Even in areas where it's not freezing, wind chill can still make it seem for the creatures as if it is below freezing. Of course, you will notice that on Arctic coasts, you basically see barren rock, for the simple reason that exposing these creatures, which have to be adapted to salt water, twice a day to literally freezing temperatures is a bad idea. Now, what else do these creatures have to do? Well, they have to resist drying out, because drying out for a marine organism means death. Drying out for even a human or any terrestrial organism also means death. But since they're adapted to salt water, well, they tend to not be as well adapted to land as they'd like, hence why they don't grow up here. So, they need water, they need the salt water, and they need to survive not having it. Well, it's a hard time, but many species have adapted. For example, some species of sea urchins, although sea urchins for the most part tend to shelter in intertidal pools and follow the tide whenever they can. Sea stars, also common in intertidal pools. Sea anemones, you will find these on coral reefs and in pools. And of course, various clams and mussels. Clams and mussels are incapable of movement, like sea anemones. They tend to be the main inhabitants of this intertidal zone. Some species will clam up, i.e. shut their shells, when the tide goes down in order to not lose too much water. Other species have adaptations to deal with, say, heat or cold that may or may not include shutting their shells. Now, in summary, aquatic ecosystems can be in freshwater, for example, lakes, rivers, streams. Well, rivers and streams are technically usually studied together for what I hope are obvious reasons. Swamps, and so on. Bogs. Or marine. For example, coral reefs, estuaries, lagoons, tidal pools, which are basically big lagoon, well, smaller lagoons. If they get big, they're called lagoons. And open ocean, of course. And the deep ocean, where there is no light. And of course, continental shelves. Continental shelves tend to be the most productive parts of the ocean, because there's light and there's nutrients. Now, the abiotic conditions of intertidal zones will change frequently, at least twice a day. Not to mention the fact that these organisms that live there also have to cling to the rocks despite the waves caused by wind hitting them. Now, these waves are very different from tides. Tides are caused by the gravity of the moon and the sun. So as Earth turns, tides occur twice a day, because the water happens to bulge, flex like this. It doesn't all move towards the moon and then move like a hump of water across the Earth. No, that's not how it works. Anyway, there is a reason that east coasts are in fact habitable, despite the Earth turning to the east. Because if the bulge of water actually followed the moon, instead of swishing back and forth, it was two bulges on either side. If it was just one big bulge on the Earth following the moon, then as Earth turns, the east coasts of the Earth would end up all getting drowned once a day. This does not happen. Well, not so much drowned as pretty much tsunami every day. But this does not happen. Instead, we have tides twice a day. Now, in some places, depending on the shape of the coastline, it may be that the tide can go many, many, many meters. For example, in the Bay of Fundy, which is between Nova Scotia, this is a really crude Nova Scotia. So here in the Bay of Fundy, because the mouth here is so much wider than up here, this means that the tide rushing in will end up building up really high. It's like funneling water. And of course, when it goes down, it goes really low. Now, anything that lives in an intertidal zone must be adapted to all these changes, which means that they are fairly tough creatures, but also that they tend to be adapted only to intertidal zones. Why? Because to adapt to deal with all of these shocks means that you might not be so good in stable conditions, and you might not be able to compete with the clams or mussels that happen to live under the intertidal zone. So if you can't compete, then your fundamental niche, which is what you're capable of filling, is going to be bigger than your realized niche, i.e. what you have made reality. Fundamental. Now, please note that these terms are not actually terms that you will actually use until considerably later. But it's good to know them anyway. Realized niche. Maybe this can even help you remember things such as niches in general. Well, that's it for this section. See you later.